The cabinet had been sealed for 61 years, and Mara Whitfield could still smell the camphor through the wood. She was 23 years old, and everything she owned fit into the back seat of a '09 Corolla with a cracked windshield. 10 months since she'd aged out of the last placement that would take her. 3 jobs lost since then. $41 in her checking account the morning the letter came. The letter said a man named Elias Whitfield, a great-uncle she had never once heard mentioned at any Thanksgiving table, any hospital waiting room, any funeral, had left her a house. County records called it condemned. The back taxes owed on it came to $340. Nobody else in the family had wanted to pay them. She'd paid them with money she didn't have, because nowhere else was a place she could afford to go. The house sat at the dead end of Cutter's Hollow Road, half swallowed by kudzu, its porch sagging like something exhausted. But it wasn't the house that stopped her breath on the 3rd day, when she finally pried the boards off the back room door with a tire iron and stepped into a space that still smelled, faintly, of dried herbs and beeswax. It was the cabinet, floor to ceiling, black walnut gone silver with dust, its dozens of small drawers still labeled in a spidery hand, valerian, calendula, iron filings, for the Hooper boy's cough. And at its center, where the drawers should have been, a single door of the same dark wood, sealed shut with a lock, unlike anything on the rest of the cabinet. No keyhole. Just a brass plate, worn smooth, and beneath it, carved so faint, she had to run her fingers across it to be sure she wasn't imagining the letters, E.W., not for the taking, only the earning. She did not know, standing there with dust in her lungs and a tire iron going slack in her hand, that the town below the hollow had a name for that cabinet. She did not know that 3 people in Millhaven had tried to buy this property in the last decade for reasons they never once explained to the county clerk. She had no idea that what her great-uncle sealed inside that door would, before the year was out, change not just what she owned, but what she understood about why he'd left it to her and not to anyone who shared his blood. Have you ever inherited something nobody else wanted and had to decide, all on your own, whether that meant it was worthless or whether everyone else had simply never looked close enough? If you're the kind of person who likes to sit with a story a while, the kind that takes its time, the kind you can leave running while you fall asleep to it, I'm glad you're here. Stay a minute, this one's worth it. The room was cold in the particular way of a house that had been closed up for decades, a cold that seemed to come from the walls themselves rather than the air. Somewhere above her, a loose shutter knocked once against the siding, and she startled so hard she dropped the tire iron, and the sound of it hitting the floorboards rang out like something breaking. She left the cabinet locked. She didn't touch it again for 11 days. What she found the day she finally did would mean nothing at all, unless she also understood, first, everything that had brought her to that door with nothing left to lose. 3 weeks earlier, Mara had been sleeping in the Corolla in a Walmart parking lot outside Roanoke, and she had told herself, the way she told herself most things now, that it was temporary. She'd told herself that about the group home in Danville too, and the one before it, and the apartment with the roommate who stopped paying rent without telling her. Temporary had stopped meaning anything. It was just a word she used, so she didn't have to use worse ones. She had aged out of the foster system at 18 with a garbage bag of clothes, a savings bond her last caseworker had pressed into her hands like an apology, and a hardness in her that she'd built the way you build a wall, brick by brick, out of necessity, with no architect and no plan for when to stop. She did not trust easily. She did not ask for help. Both of those things had kept her alive for 5 years, and both of them, though she didn't know it yet, were about to be tested in ways she couldn't outrun. She had never met Elias Whitfield. She barely knew his name existed until the lawyer's letter, forwarded 3 times through old addresses, finally caught up to her at a P.O. box she'd nearly stopped checking. Her mother, dead when Mara was 9, a car accident on wet mountain roads, had a father who had a brother, and that brother was Elias, and that was the whole of what she knew. Nobody in what remained of her family had spoken of him. When she'd called her mother's cousin, the only relative who still answered her calls, to ask what she knew, the woman had gone quiet on the line in a way that told Mara there was more to the silence than simple distance. He was strange, the cousin said finally. Kept to himself, ran that old apothecary shop out of the house, mixed up tinctures and salves, sold them out of the back room to folks in town who didn't trust doctors or couldn't afford them. Your grandfather and him didn't speak the last 20 years of his life. I don't know the whole story. I don't think anybody does anymore. Why would he leave it to me? He never even met me. A pause. Maybe that's exactly why. Mara hadn't understood that answer then. She would come to understand it, slowly, over the months that followed. But on the day she signed the paperwork at the county courthouse, handed over $340 that left her with less than $50 to her name, she understood only that she had a roof, however broken, and a door that finally had her name on the deed instead of someone else's. The drive up Cutter's Hollow Road took her past a gas station with one working pump, a church with a sign that read, "God's not done with you yet," in movable plastic letters, and a diner with a hand-painted sign, Patsy's, where two old men sat in the window and watched her Corolla rattle past with open, unhurried curiosity. Small towns noticed strangers. She was used to being noticed and not welcomed. She braced for it, the way she braced for most things now, out of habit more than fear. The house itself, when she finally reached it, nearly made her turn around. Kudzu had swallowed half the porch. A window on the second floor had a tree branch growing straight through it. The paint, what remained of it, had gone the grey-green color of something left to rot in the rain for longer than a house should be left to do anything. She sat in the car for 11 full minutes before she made herself get out, and when she did, the boards of the porch steps groaned under her weight in a way that made her flinch back, half certain they'd give way entirely. She had nowhere else to go. That was the only reason she climbed them anyway. The inside was worse and better than she expected. Worse, because whole sections of the ceiling had come down in the back bedroom, and something had clearly been living in the walls at some point. Better, because the front rooms, though thick with dust, were largely intact, furniture still standing where it had been left, as though Elias Whitfield had simply stepped out one day and never come back to finish anything. A pot still sat on the stove, a coat still hung by the door. It was in the kitchen, going through a drawer for anything useful, that she found the first thing that didn't add up, a small brass key, tied with twine to a tag that read only "not yet" in the same spidery hand as the cabinet's carving, tucked beneath a stack of yellowed receipts from a hardware store that had closed, according to the date, in 1987. She didn't know yet what the key opened. She only knew, holding it in her palm in that dust-choked kitchen with the light going gold through a cracked window, that it wasn't nothing, and that whatever "not yet" meant, she was going to find out. The town of Millhaven learned about Mara Whitfield before she learned much of anything about it. She found that out the first time she walked into Patsy's diner, 3 days after moving into the house, in search of a hot meal and a working outlet to charge her phone. The two old men from the window booth were still there. She would learn later they were nearly always there, a fixture as permanent as the counter stools, and they stopped talking the second the bell over the door announced her. "You're the Whitfield girl," one of them said. Not a question. She hadn't told anyone her name yet. She'd been in town for exactly one trip to the gas station. "News travels," the woman behind the counter said, setting down a coffee pot with the particular brisk efficiency of someone who ran a diner for a living and had opinions about most things that walked through her door. She had grey hair pulled back tight, a face that had spent decades in either sun or judgment, possibly both, and a name tag that read Patsy in case there was any doubt about ownership. I'm Patsy. That's Hollis, and that's Dean. Sit wherever. You look like you need a meal that isn't from a gas station. Mara sat at the counter, not a booth, because a counter seat didn't feel like committing to conversation the way a booth across from strangers did. Hollis, it turned out, had known her great-uncle for close to 40 years. Dean had known him only in passing, kept odd hours, that one, and odder company, but seemed to have opinions anyway, the way men in small towns often did, about things they hadn't personally witnessed. Elias was a good man, Hollis said, in the tone of someone laying groundwork for a butt. Helped my wife through a bad flu one winter, when the doctor in Marion was a 2-hour drive, and we didn't have the money for it besides. Mixed her something out of that back room of his. Worked, too, whatever it was. But, Mara said, because the but was sitting right there in the silence. Hollis exchanged a glance with Dean that she couldn't read. But he had a falling out with your grandfather. Bad one. Nobody round here ever got the whole story, and Elias wasn't a man who explained himself to folks who didn't ask direct. Did you ask direct? Once, Hollis said. He told me some things weren't his to tell, and some things weren't finished yet. Never did explain what he meant by that. He studied her for a moment over his coffee cup, something assessing in it that she didn't love being on the receiving end of. You look like your grandmother, you know. Around the eyes. Mara didn't know what to do with that. She'd never seen a photograph of her grandmother. She hadn't known, until that exact sentence, that anyone left alive could tell her what the woman looked like. She ate her meal in a silence that Patsy filled with brisk, unbothered chatter about nothing in particular. The weather turning, a church potluck coming up, a feud between two families over a property line that had apparently been simmering since before Mara was born. And when she paid at the counter, Patsy studied her for a second, the way Hollis had. That house has been sitting empty a long time, Patsy said. Lot of folks round here wondered what had become of it. Wondered how? Patsy's expression did something complicated, not quite evasive, but careful. Just wondered. Small towns wonder about empty houses. It's not a mystery, honey. It's just what we do with our time. But she said it a half-beat too fast, and Mara, who had spent 5 years learning to read rooms because reading them wrong had cost her things, filed it away as something to come back to. The work on the house started small, because it had to. She didn't have money for contractors, so she learned. YouTube videos on patching drywall. Watched on the phone she could only charge at the diner or the gas station until she got the power turned back on. A trip to the hardware store 40 minutes away for tools she bought one at a time, each purchase a calculation against the shrinking number in her bank account. She patched the roof leak over the back bedroom with a tarp and a prayer, cleared the kudzu off the porch by hand until her palms blistered and then calloused, and slept, for the first 2 weeks, in a sleeping bag on the front room floor, because the upstairs bedrooms didn't feel safe yet, and something about the ground floor, close to the door, felt like an exit she might still need. It was on day 9, prying loose a rotted board on the porch, that she found the second thing that didn't add up. A small hollow beneath the boards, empty except for a rusted tin that had once held tobacco, and inside the tin, a folded scrap of paper, too water-damaged to read except for 4 words that had survived. Tell her when ready. She sat on the porch steps a long time with that scrap in her hand, the afternoon light going long and gold across the yard, a mourning dove calling somewhere in the tree line, and she found herself furious in a way she hadn't expected, not at Elias exactly, but at the shape of a life built entirely out of things left half-said. She was so tired of half-said things. Her whole life had been a series of adults deciding what she was and wasn't ready to hear. She went back into the house that evening and stood in front of the apothecary cabinet for a long time, the brass key from the kitchen drawer sitting heavy in her pocket, and she told herself she would try it, and then didn't, because some old instinct, some voice that sounded uncomfortably like every caseworker who'd ever told her not yet, "Sweetheart, "You're not ready for that information," stopped her hand an inch from the lock. Instead, she went looking for the room's other secrets first. Behind a warped floorboard near the cabinet, she found a leather ledger, its pages brittle and foxed with age, filled with the same spidery handwriting: names, dates, small sums of money, notes like paid in full, Hooper, March, and forgave debt, the cordial place, hard winter. Dozens of entries stretching back decades. Elias Whitfield, it seemed, had spent a lifetime quietly forgiving what people in Millhaven owed him. Near the ledger's final pages, one entry stopped her cold, a name she recognized, because it was her mother's. Set aside for R. Not yet. R for Ruth. Her mother's name. Mara read it 4 times, sitting cross-legged on the dusty floor of a back room that had once smelled of valerian and beeswax, and felt something crack open in her chest that she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite hope, not quite grief. Something braided out of both. Elias Whitfield had known her mother's name, had set something aside for her, had written not yet in a ledger decades before Mara was even born, as though he'd been waiting. For what? She had no idea. Her mother had died when Mara was 9. Whatever not yet had once meant, it had run out of time to become now for the woman it was meant for. Which meant, Mara understood slowly, sitting alone in the gathering dark, that whatever came next in that ledger's unfinished promise, it was hers now. Not because she'd earned it, because there was no one else left to give it to. She closed the ledger, and for the first time since she'd arrived in Millhaven, she didn't feel like a stranger squatting in a dead man's ruin. She felt like she'd walked, without meaning to, into the middle of a story that had been waiting a very long time for someone to finish reading it. Outside, the shutter knocked once against the siding again, and this time she didn't startle. She only wondered, staring at the cabinet's dark shape in the dying light, how much longer not yet was going to last, and what, exactly, would have to happen before it finally became now. The man showed up on a Tuesday, driving a truck too clean for the roads out here, and Mara knew before he opened his mouth that he wanted something. She was up on a ladder trying to patch the section of roof over the kitchen when she heard the engine, and by the time she climbed down, he was already standing at the edge of her yard, like he was deciding whether the kudzu still counted as her property line or his to walk across. "You must be Elias's grandniece," he said, offering a handshake she didn't take, mostly because her hands were covered in roofing tar. "Nathaniel Cordell. I own the hardware store in Marion, and a fair bit else besides. I knew your uncle a little, in a business way." "What kind of business?" He held a note on some equipment of mine, years back. "We settled it." Cordell smiled in a way that didn't reach anything behind his eyes. "I'll be straight with you, since I expect you're a straight-talking sort. I'd like to buy this property. House, land, all of it. I'll pay well over what the county's got it valued at. More than fair, given the condition." Mara looked at the house behind her, the tarp still flapping loose over one corner of the roof, the porch half cleared, the whole place looking about as far from valuable as a property could look, and felt the first prickle of something that wasn't quite suspicion yet, but was standing close enough to it to shake hands. "Why?" "Sentimental reasons," Cordell said smoothly. "I've always admired the old place. Shame to see it fall down." It was, Mara thought, one of the least convincing sentences she'd ever heard a grown man say with a straight face. She'd spent 5 years reading rooms for a living, more or less, and every instinct she had told her that whatever Nathaniel Cordell wanted from Cutter's Hollow Road, it had nothing to do with sentiment. "I'm not selling," she said. "Everybody's got a price, Miss Whitfield." "Maybe. But you'd have to tell me what I'm actually selling before I could name one." She held his gaze, tar-stained hands and all, and watched something flicker behind his composure. Not anger exactly, more like recalculation. "Have a good drive back to Marion." He left with a card pressed into her hand that she didn't ask for, and a line, "You'll want to reconsider once you understand what you're sitting on." that she turned over in her mind for the rest of the day, like a stone she couldn't stop rubbing smooth. She told Hollis about it that evening, having taken to stopping at Patsy's most nights now, less for the food than for the particular comfort of a lit room with other people in it, after a day of silence and dust. Hollis's face did something guarded when she said Cordell's name. "Nathaniel Cordell," he repeated, like the name itself needed rinsing out of his mouth. "That family's been sniffing around your uncle's land longer than you've been alive. Near enough. Sniffing around how?" Hollis glanced at Patsy, who was very deliberately wiping down a section of counter that didn't need it. "There was talk, years back, about what Elias kept in that shop of his. Cordell's daddy tried to buy the place off him twice, back in the 80s. Elias ran him off both times with a shotgun he never once loaded, far as I know. But the man didn't know that. What kind of talk?" "Just talk," Hollis said, which was the second time in 2 days somebody in this town had used that phrase to close a door Mara very much wanted open. "Old stories. Probably nothing to them. You don't sound like you believe that." Hollis studied his coffee for a long moment. "I believe your uncle didn't build a locked cabinet and a shotgun reputation over nothing, if that's what you're asking." He looked up at her, and something in his face softened, just slightly, the look of a man deciding to trust someone. "You want my advice? Don't sell that man so much as a fence post. Whatever he wants off that land, it's worth more to him than what he's offering you, or he wouldn't have driven all the way out here to offer it." That night, back at the house, Mara found herself standing in front of the cabinet again, key in hand, the 4 surviving words from the porch, "Tell her when ready," running through her mind on a loop. She thought about her mother's name in the ledger. She thought about a man in a too-clean truck offering more than fair for a falling-down house. She thought about Not Yet, and wondered, not for the first time, who got to decide when Not Yet finally ran out. She didn't open it. Not yet, herself, though she couldn't have said exactly why. Only that some part of her, the same part that had learned the hard way not to trust good things arriving too easily, wanted to understand the shape of the story before she let it hand her an ending. Instead, she went looking for answers a different way. The county records office in Marion, she'd learned from a flyer at the diner, kept old deed and business filings going back a century, open to the public 3 days a week. She drove out the next morning, the Corolla's engine making a sound she'd been ignoring for 200 miles too long, and spent 4 hours in a records room that smelled of old paper and dust, pulling every file with the name Whitfield or Cordell on it. What she found only deepened the hole rather than filling it. A land survey from 1961 showing the boundary of the Whitfield property extending further than the current deed reflected. A strip of land, maybe 2 acres, that seemed to have quietly changed hands sometime in the following decade, though the paperwork explaining how was missing from the file, a gap that felt less like an accident and more like something removed on purpose. A business license for Whitfield's Remedies, renewed every year without fail until 18 months before Elias's death, then abruptly not renewed at all, as though he'd known that final year that he was done. And tucked in the back of the file, nearly missed, a single newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, from a paper that no longer existed. A photograph of a much younger Elias Whitfield standing in front of the very cabinet Mara now owned, and beside him, unnamed in the caption, a woman whose face, even in cheap newsprint gone soft with age, Mara recognized immediately, because she had spent 9 years of her childhood looking up into it. Her mother. Mara sat very still in the quiet of that records room, the clipping trembling slightly in her hand, and understood that whatever Not Yet had meant, and whatever Nathaniel Cordell wanted badly enough to drive 40 minutes on a Tuesday to ask for it, the answer to both questions was sitting in a locked cabinet back on Cutter's Hollow Road. and that she had just run out of reasons to keep waiting to find out what it was. She drove home from Marion with the newspaper clipping on the passenger seat, like a live thing she didn't want to look at directly. And she didn't sleep that night, not really. Just lay in the sleeping bag on the front room floor, watching the shape of the cabinet through the open doorway, lit faint silver by the moon coming through the cracked kitchen window, until the sky outside started going grey at the edges. At first light, she got up, made coffee on the camp stove she'd been using since she'd moved in, and walked into the back room before she could talk herself into waiting one more day. The brass key fit the lock, the way a key fits a lock it was always meant for. No force required, just a small, definite click, as though the cabinet had been waiting exactly as long as she had. The door swung open on a hinge that hadn't moved in decades, and the smell that came out was different from the rest of the house. Not dust and rot, but something drier, sealed, preserved, cedar, old paper, faintly, still, the ghost of camphor. Inside, on the top shelf, was not what she expected. No gold, no jewels, nothing out of a movie. Just bundles of cash, banded in old rubber that had gone brittle and snapped when she touched them, stacked with a kind of careful, patient order. 20s and 50s, some bills old enough that she didn't immediately recognize the printing. Beneath the cash, a small wooden box holding what looked, to her untrained eye, like silver coins and a few pieces of jewelry, tarnished dark with age. And beneath that, at the very bottom of the cabinet, a leather folder tied shut with the same twine that had held the key. She counted the cash with shaking hands at the kitchen table, sunlight coming up gold through the window, and stopped somewhere past $31,000 because her hands were shaking too badly to keep the stacks straight, and because, somewhere around 20,000, she'd started crying in a way she didn't fully understand. Not joy, exactly. Not yet. Something closer to disbelief, cracking open a door that led to grief. It wasn't the money that undid her. It was what she found when she finally untied the leather folder. Inside was a letter, several pages, written in the same spidery hand as the ledger, dated 11 years earlier, the year, she would realize later, that her mother had died. "Ruth," it began, and Mara had to set it down on the table for a full minute before she could make herself keep reading, because seeing her mother's name in a dead man's handwriting felt like a door opening onto a room she hadn't known existed in her own life. "Ruth, if you're the one reading this, then I expect a great deal of time has passed, and I expect you have questions I should have answered a long while ago. I am an old man now, and old men run out of someday, so I am writing this down instead, because I would rather you have my words on paper than not have them at all. Your father and I did not speak for 20 years, and the fault for that was mine more than his, though pride kept me from ever telling him so to his face. I loved your mother before he did. I stepped aside when she chose him, because that was the right thing to do, and I have never regretted the choosing, only the silence that grew up after it, the way silence does when two proud men decide it's easier than saying anything true. By the time I was ready to put it down, he was gone, and there was no one left to forgive me but you. I have watched you from a distance your whole life, Ruth, the way a man watches a garden he isn't allowed to tend. I heard about your girl. I heard, later, about the accident, and I am an old fool who let too much time pass, deciding how to reach out. And then there was no reaching out left to do. Mara stopped reading. Her hands were pressed flat against the table, and the kitchen had gone very quiet except for the sound of her own breathing, and outside a mourning dove called once, twice, the same patient sound she'd been hearing every morning since she arrived, and she understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that the letter in front of her had not been written to her at all. It had been written to her mother, 11 years too late to reach her, which meant that whatever came next on those pages, whatever Elias Whitfield had meant to say to a daughter he'd never publicly claimed, a woman he'd loved from a garden he wasn't allowed to tend. Mara was reading it now only because there had been no one else left alive to read it in her place. She sat with that for a long time before she turned the page, the money still stacked on the table beside her, suddenly the least important thing in the room. If you have a child, Ruth, and something tells this foolish old man that you might, tell her about this place when she's ready. Tell her the money is hers if she needs it, but tell her it was never the point. The point was always the land, and what a person builds when they've got nothing left to lose and nowhere left to run. I built a whole life out of a broken-down house and a room full of strangers who needed tending to more than they needed judging. I hope, whoever ends up reading this, that they'll understand. The cabinet was never the gift. The chance was the gift. The cabinet was just where I kept it safe until someone was ready to open the door. The letter ended there, unsigned except for a single initial, E. And beneath it, in different ink, added later, a shorter line that looked like it had been written in a shakier hand, closer to the end. If it's you reading this instead, and not her, I am sorrier than I know how to say. But I think she would have wanted you to have it anyway. Blood finds its way to blood, in the end, even through people too stubborn to say so out loud. Mara sat at the kitchen table with the letter, and the money, and the morning dove still calling somewhere in the yard, and cried in a way she hadn't let herself cry since she was 9 years old, and a police officer had knelt down to tell her that her mother wasn't coming home, not for the money, and not even entirely for the grief of it, but for the strange, aching relief of understanding, for the first time in a long while, that she had not simply inherited a ruin. She had inherited the end of a story that had been waiting, patiently, for someone to finally be ready to read it. Outside, in the drive, gravel crunched under tires that didn't belong to her Corolla, and through the kitchen window, she saw Nathaniel Cordell's truck pulling up to the house for the second time in a week. She had the letter still open on the kitchen table, the money in loose stacks beside it, when Cordell knocked on her door like a man who believed knocking was a formality rather than a request. She thought about not answering. She thought about it for exactly as long as it took her to remember Hollis's voice. Whatever he wants off that land, it's worth more to him than what he's offering you, and decided she would rather know than wonder. She stepped out onto the porch instead of letting him in, the letter and the money both out of sight, her heart still raw and unsteady from what she'd just read. Miss Whitfield. Cordell had a folder under his arm this time, the kind of prop that was meant to look official. I thought I'd give you another chance to reconsider, now that you've had time to look the place over properly. I have looked it over properly, she said, which is why I'm even less interested than I was on Tuesday. Something in his jaw tightened. You don't know what you're sitting on. Then tell me. She folded her arms, tar-stained sleeves and all, and watched him decide how much truth he could afford to spend. You keep saying that like it's supposed to scare me into selling. It's not working. Try telling me something true instead. Cordell studied her for a long moment, and something behind his composure shifted. Not defeat, exactly, but recalculation. The look of a man realizing his first strategy had run its course. There was a mineral survey done on this land back in the 60s. Never finished. Your uncle ran the surveyors off before they completed it, same as he ran off my father twice. But what they found before he stopped them suggested a vein of something worth considerably more than back taxes. He let that sit. My family spent 3 generations trying to get another look at that survey. Your uncle spent just as long making sure nobody could. Why would he stop a survey that might have made him rich? Because Elias Whitfield, Cordell said, with the particular bitterness of a man repeating a story he'd heard resented his whole life, didn't want to be rich. He wanted to be left alone, and he'd rather sit on a fortune and dole out nickel tinctures to sick farmers than let men like my father dig it up and change this whole hollow into something it wasn't. He shook his head. I'm offering you what my father never got the chance to offer him, A clean sale. Real money. Fast. No digging required on your end. You walk away with more than you'd see in 10 years. Scraping by out here. Mara thought of the money in the cabinet. Thought of the letter, still warm from her own hands. Still smelling faintly of camphor. Thought of a man who'd spent 40 years running off buyers with an unloaded shotgun rather than let anyone touch what he'd decided belonged to no one but the people who needed tending. "I'm not selling," she said again. "But thank you for telling me true. Finally. That's worth more than your offer, if you want to know." Cordell left angrier than he'd arrived, which told her more than anything he'd said. She told Hollis and Patsy everything that evening. The letter, the money, the mineral survey, all of it spilling out across the diner counter in a rush she hadn't planned, because she'd spent so long keeping things locked down tight that having something to finally hand to someone else felt like setting down a bag she'd been carrying too long. Patsy went quiet, in a way that wasn't her usual brisk quiet. She set down the coffee pot and came around the counter and sat on the stool beside Mara, which Mara understood, even in her exhaustion, was not a thing Patsy did. "Your uncle patched up my boy's hand once," Patsy said. "After a mill accident nearly took 2 fingers off him. Doctor in Marion wanted $800 we didn't have. Elias didn't charge us a dime. Told me to pay him back by teaching somebody else something useful someday." She wiped at her eyes with the back of her wrist, quick and almost angry about it. "I never did figure out what he meant by that, till just now, hearing you talk. What do you think he meant?" "I think," Patsy said slowly, "he wasn't building a fortune. He was building a debt that never stopped moving forward. One kindness paying into the next one, generation after generation, whether the money was ever involved or not." She looked at Mara with something that had shifted, over the past week, from wary curiosity into something closer to fondness. "Seems to me you're standing right in the middle of that chain now, whether you ask to be or not." Hollis, quieter than usual, added only, "Your uncle would have liked you standing up to Cordell like that. He never did suffer men who thought money settled every question." That night, back at the house, Mara went through the ledger again, with new eyes, understanding now what she was looking at. Not a record of debts owed to Elias Whitfield, but a record of a man quietly rebuilding a town, one forgiven bill at a time, for decades, without ever once asking for recognition. Names she now recognized from 3 days in Millhaven filled its pages. Hollis's, more than once. A Cordell, too, oddly enough, from decades back. A debt marked forgiven, though he'll never thank me for it in handwriting that felt, for the first time, almost wry. She thought about the mineral survey Cordell claimed sat beneath her land. She thought about $31,000 in cash, and a box of tarnished silver sitting on her kitchen table. She thought about the porch groaning under her feet the first day she'd climbed it. Certain, then, that she had nothing and would have to build something out of nothing regardless. She didn't have nothing anymore. But she understood, reading that ledger by lamplight with the shutter knocking softly against the siding outside, that the money wasn't the thing that had changed. She had changed. Somewhere in 3 weeks of roofing tar and blistered hands and a locked cabinet finally opened, she'd stopped bracing for the ground to give way beneath her. She fell asleep at the kitchen table with the ledger still open and woke before dawn to the sound of something she couldn't immediately place. A low groan from somewhere upstairs, wood under stress, followed by a crack sharp enough to jolt her fully awake. She got to the bottom of the stairs just in time to see a section of the upstairs hallway ceiling give way entirely. Decades of water damage finally losing its fight with gravity, collapsing in a cloud of plaster dust, and old lath not 10 feet from where she stood, close enough that if she'd been climbing those stairs 1 minute earlier, she wouldn't be standing here to see it happen. The dust hadn't even settled before Mara understood how close it had been. She stood at the bottom of the stairs in the grey pre-dawn light, staring up at a hole in the ceiling wide enough to see straight through to the roof rafters, insulation, and broken lath scattered across the hallway floor like the remains of something that had finally given up holding itself together. 10 feet. If she'd woken 20 minutes earlier, if she'd gone up for a blanket, if she'd chosen that morning instead of the kitchen table to fall asleep, she didn't let herself finish the thought. She'd learned a long time ago that dwelling on the almost happened only made the actual world harder to stand in. She climbed the stairs carefully, testing each one, and found the source of it easily enough once she reached the top. The old roof leak she'd patched with a tarp weeks earlier had done its slow work anyway, water finding its way in around the edges for longer than she'd realized, rotting the joists above the hallway until they simply couldn't hold anymore. It wasn't bad luck. It was neglect. Decades of it, finally catching up all at once, the kind of thing that happened to houses left too long without anybody tending them. And, she thought grimly, probably to people too. She spent the whole day clearing debris, and by afternoon, exhausted and covered in plaster dust, she understood something she hadn't wanted to face yet. Patching problems one YouTube video at a time had gotten her this far, but the house had structural damage now that was past her skill and past her tools. She needed real help. She needed it before the next storm, before the next joist gave out somewhere worse. Over the kitchen, say, where she slept most nights now. She had $31,000 in cash, sitting in a cabinet. For the first time since she'd found it, she let herself think of it as something to actually spend. Hollis showed up the next morning, before she'd even called anyone, driving a truck nearly as old as Cordell's had been new, with 2 other men in the bed. His nephew, a broad-shouldered young man named Cal who didn't say much, and worked harder than anyone Mara had ever met, and an older man named Sam Everly, who turned out to be a retired contractor, and, as it happened, one more name in Elias Whitfield's ledger, marked forgiven, hard year, don't tell him I said so. Patsy called me, Hollis said, by way of explanation, climbing down out of the truck. Told me about your ceiling, figured you could use hands that know what they're doing more than you could use another YouTube video. Mara opened her mouth to say she could pay them, that she didn't need charity, that same old wall going up brick by brick out of habit, and then stopped herself, because she thought of the ledger, of decades of a man quietly keeping a whole town afloat without ever asking for thanks, and understood that turning down help now would be its own kind of insult to everything she'd just spent a week learning about him. I can pay, she said instead. Fair wages, not charity. Sam Everly grinned, weathered and easy. Elias never would have taken your money either, first offer. But he'd have let you insist, second time round. Man had his pride, same as you're carrying. They worked through the joists first, then the roof properly this time. Real materials instead of tarps and prayer. And Mara worked alongside them, learning as she went. How to read a level, how to frame a proper repair instead of a patch, how to swing a hammer without hurting her wrist by the end of the day. Cal, it turned out, talked plenty once he decided you were worth talking to, and by the 3rd day he was telling her about his own plans to start a small carpentry business once he'd saved enough, and Mara found herself, without entirely meaning to, offering him a fair chunk of the roofing money as an advance on work she wanted done anyway. The porch railing, replaced properly, the kitchen cabinets, repaired rather than gutted. It wasn't charity, either direction. It was something else, something she didn't have a clean word for yet. The ledger's chain of forgiven debts, still moving forward, whether the money involved was a loan, or a wage, or simply an hour of someone's time freely given. Cordell came by once more that week, saw the trucks in the drive and the scaffolding going up along the roofline, and didn't bother getting out of his own truck this time. He rolled the window down just far enough to say, "You're pouring good money into a house sitting on land you don't understand the value of." And Mara, up on the scaffold with a hammer in her hand and sawdust in her hair, called back down without missing a beat. Maybe, but at least I'll understand what I built on it." He drove off without another word, and Hollis, working beside her, laughed for the first time since she'd met him. A real laugh, surprised out of him. "Your uncle used to say something near enough to that, word for word, near enough to give me a chill just now." That night, after the crew had gone home and the house had gone quiet again, Mara sat on the newly repaired porch steps with a cup of coffee going cold in her hands, looking out at a yard that no longer looked entirely like ruin. Kudzu cleared, porch solid underfoot, a roofline that wouldn't cave in on her again, and let herself feel something she hadn't let herself feel in longer than she could easily remember. Not safety, exactly. She wasn't sure she trusted safety yet, not all the way down, but something close to it, something that felt like ground that might actually hold. She thought about the mineral survey Cordell kept dangling, half threat and half temptation, and wondered, not for the first time, but for the first time without dread attached to the wondering, what exactly her great-uncle had found under this land decades ago, and why a man who'd had the chance to be rich had chosen, instead, to spend his whole life quietly rich, in a way that never once showed up on paper. She didn't have the answer yet, but sitting there in the cooling evening air, porch solid beneath her for the first time since she'd arrived, she found she wasn't in nearly as much of a hurry to find it as she once would have been. Upstairs, through the freshly repaired ceiling, she could hear nothing at all. No groan, no shift, no warning. Just quiet. The particular quiet of a house finally being cared for by somebody who intended to stay. But quiet, she was learning, wasn't always the same thing as finished. And somewhere beneath her, in ground Cordell wanted badly enough to keep circling back for, something was still waiting to be understood. The letter from the State Forestry Office arrived on a Thursday, tucked between a seed catalogue and a bill from the electric company, and Mara almost didn't open it right away because it looked, at a glance, like exactly the kind of official-looking nothing she'd learned to ignore over the years. She opened it anyway, standing at the mailbox at the end of the drive, and read it twice before the words settled into something she could actually understand. The county was reassessing mineral rights on several parcels along Cutter's Hollow Road, following what the letter called renewed private interest in historical survey data, and Whitfield land was one of 3 parcels named. A public notice period had opened. Any current mineral surveys on file, completed or not, would be reviewed as part of the reassessment. Mara stood at the mailbox a long time, the letter shaking slightly in her hand, and understood with a sinking clarity exactly whose renewed private interest this was. Cordell hadn't given up. He'd simply stopped asking her directly and started working the county instead. She drove to Marion that afternoon, and after 2 hours in the same records office where she'd found the newspaper clipping, a clerk who remembered her from the week before quietly confirmed what she'd already suspected. Nathaniel Cordell had filed the request for reassessment himself, citing family historical interest in an incomplete 1961 survey. "He can't force a survey on your land without your permission," the clerk told her, not unkindly. "But he can make life difficult trying to get it. Reassessments open the door to easement disputes, boundary challenges, all sorts of things a determined man with money can drag out for years if he wants to make a point." Mara drove home with her hands tight on the wheel, past Patsy's, past the church sign that this week read, "Trouble don't last always," and felt, for the first time since she'd opened the cabinet, the ground shift a little under everything she'd started to believe was solid. She told Hollis and Sam that evening, sitting on the porch steps she'd helped rebuild with her own hands, and watched Sam's easy-weathered face go serious in a way she hadn't seen from him yet. "Elias fought this exact fight 40 years ago," Sam said. "Cordell's daddy tried the same play. County reassessment, easement pressure, dragging it out till a man's too tired or too broke to keep saying no. Your uncle held the line because he had time, and stubbornness, and not much else to lose. I don't have 40 years. No, Sam agreed. But you've got something your uncle didn't have back then. He nodded toward the house behind her, the new roofline, the solid porch, the cleared yard. You've got people now who'll stand with you on it. He fought that fight alone. You won't have to. It should have comforted her more than it did. Instead, lying awake that night listening to the house settle around her, no groaning joists now, just the ordinary creak of old wood cooling after a warm day, she found herself circling back to the mineral survey itself, the one Elias had stopped decades ago before it finished. If there really was something valuable under this land, something worth 2 generations of a family's persistence, then the fight wasn't going to end with one denied reassessment. Cordell would keep coming, the way water kept finding its way through a roof, no matter how many tarps you laid over the leak. She needed to understand what she was actually protecting, not the vague shape of something valuable, the real thing, if it existed at all. The answer, when it came, arrived from an unlikely place. Cal, Hollis's nephew, still working through the last of the carpentry Mara had hired him for, mentioned almost in passing, while framing the new porch railing, that his grandfather had worked survey crews out of Marion back in the 60s and might remember something about a job that got cut short out on Cutter's Hollow Road. The grandfather, it turned out, was 91, sharp-eyed despite a body that had mostly given up on him, and delighted to have a visitor ask about anything at all. Mara sat with him on his own porch 2 counties over, a tape recorder from Cal's truck running between them, while the old man talked. "Wasn't gold, if that's what folks always assumed," he said, chuckling at some private joke. "Old Elias let that rumor run because it kept the wrong kind of digging away from the right kind of secret. What we found before he ran us off was a mineral spring. Good one. Mineral content strong enough that, back then, a company out of Roanoke wanted to bottle it, build a little resort around it, the whole business. Elias didn't want strangers tramping all over his land for a spa, told the survey crew to pack up and go, and told the company, when they came asking themselves, that the spring wasn't for sale at any price." He shook his head, still amused after 60 years. Man wasn't sitting on gold. He was sitting on quiet, and he valued that a whole lot higher than money. Never did understand why nobody believed him when he said so. Mara sat with that for a long moment, the recorder still running, the porch swing creaking gently under the old man's weight. A mineral spring. Not a fortune to be dug up and hauled away. A resource that could support a modest business if someone chose to build one carefully, on her own terms, in her own time. Nothing Cordell could strip out and sell off in a single transaction, which meant nothing worth the endless legal fight he seemed prepared to wage, once the truth of it was known widely enough to strip away his leverage. It also meant something else, something that settled into her chest slowly on the drive home. Elias hadn't stopped that survey out of secrecy for its own sake. He'd stopped it to protect the land from becoming something it wasn't meant to be, turned into a resort, strangers everywhere, the particular quiet he'd spent his whole life guarding, gone. She understood that instinct now in a way she hadn't a month ago. She'd spent 3 weeks learning, plank by plank and hour by hour, exactly what it meant to build something worth protecting. She wasn't about to hand Nathaniel Cordell the chance to tear it apart over a rumor he'd never bothered to actually confirm. She had what she needed now, not a fortune, but the truth. And sometimes, she was starting to understand, the truth was the sharper tool anyway. Mara requested a public comment period at the county reassessment hearing, and Sam Everly, it turned out, still had enough standing in Marion from his contracting years to get her a slot on the agenda faster than she'd expected. She stood in front of a half-empty municipal room 3 days later, hands cold despite the warmth of the room, and told the story plainly, not the money, not the ledger, none of what felt private and hers alone, but the spring itself, the 91-year-old surveyman's recorded account, and her great-uncle's 40-year refusal to let it become anything other than what it was. She watched two county officials exchange a glance she couldn't fully read, and she watched Nathaniel Cordell, sitting 3 rows back in a suit that fit a courtroom better than a hardware store, go very still. Mr. Cordell's request cites historical interest in an incomplete survey, she said, voice steadier than she felt. I'd asked the county to consider why that survey stayed incomplete for 60 years, and whether one family's persistence should outweigh a landowner's right to simply say no. The reassessment wasn't denied outright. Bureaucracy rarely moved that cleanly. But the board tabled it pending further review, which Sam told her afterward, in the parking lot, was about as close to a win as these things ever got on a first pass. Cordell caught her eye once on his way out, and for the first time since she'd met him, he didn't look calculating. He looked like a man realizing an inheritance of his own. His father's 40-year grudge had finally run out of road. She thought that might be the end of it. It wasn't. The storm came 4 nights later, the kind the Weather Service called a 100-year event, and the kind Millhaven's old-timers said they'd seen twice already in the last decade. Climate, or bad luck, or both. Mara watched the sky go the color of a bruise from her newly solid porch, and by the time the wind picked up in earnest, she understood this wasn't going to be something she could ride out with a tarp and stubbornness. The power went first. Then, somewhere past midnight, a limb from the old oak at the edge of the yard came down across the corner of the roof. Not the section they'd repaired, but close enough that the new work groaned under the strain, and Mara spent the worst hour of the night bracing a section of ceiling with her own 2 hands and a stack of lumber left over from the porch job, rain coming through in a cold sheet, thunder loud enough to rattle the windows in their frames. She thought, at the height of it, soaked through and shaking with cold and adrenaline both, that she might lose the whole roof after all. After everything. After the crew and the money and the letter and the fight with Cordell, brought down by nothing more than weather she couldn't argue or negotiate with. She didn't lose it. The lumber held, barely, long enough for the worst of the wind to pass. And when dawn came grey and exhausted over a yard scattered with branches and debris, Mara sat on her own front steps in wet clothes, too tired to cry, and understood something that felt bigger than the storm itself. She had not run. 11 months ago, faced with something this frightening, she would have gotten in the Corolla and driven until the fear was smaller in the rearview mirror than it was in front of her. She hadn't even considered it this time. Some part of her, without her quite noticing when it happened, had stopped being a person who ran from collapsing things and become a person who braced them up instead. Hollis and Cal showed up within the hour, chainsaws in the truck bed before she'd even finished texting, and by afternoon, half the crew that had rebuilt her roof was back clearing the oak limb and checking the framing, refusing payment this time in a way that felt less like charity and more like something closer to family, showing up, because that's simply what family did. It was Patsy who found her sitting on the porch that evening, hollowed out from the night before, and sat down beside her, the way she had that first evening at the diner counter. Your uncle used to say the hardest part of building anything worth having wasn't the building, Patsy said. It was staying, once you understood exactly what it might cost you to keep it. I almost lost the roof last night. You didn't, though. Patsy patted her knee, brisk and warm at once. That's the part that matters. Not the almost, the didn't. Mara sat with that as the evening cooled around her, the yard still scattered with storm debris, the house behind her standing despite everything the night had thrown at it, and thought about Elias Whitfield's letter. The point was always the land, and what a person builds when they've got nothing left to lose. She'd had nothing left to lose the day she arrived. She wasn't sure that was still true anymore, and the thought of it, of actually having something worth the fear of losing it, was its own strange, unfamiliar kind of vertigo. 2 days later, a certified letter arrived from the county, and this time, it wasn't Cordell's doing. The reassessment request had been formally withdrawn, not by the board, but by Cordell himself, according to the brief note attached. No explanation given. Just a signature, and beneath it, in handwriting far less composed than his usual careful business script, 4 words that Mara read 3 times before she understood she wasn't imagining the strangeness of them. Your uncle was right. She never did find out exactly what changed his mind, whether it was the storm, or the hearing, or something older and more private he'd finally made peace with on his own. But she folded the letter and set it in the leather folder alongside Elias's, and understood, standing in her rebuilt kitchen with a mineral spring somewhere beneath her feet, and a town full of people who'd started calling her by name instead of the Whitfield girl, that the hardest part of the fight, at last, appeared to be over. What came next, she suspected, would be quieter. But quiet, she was learning, didn't mean nothing was still happening. It only meant she'd finally earned the right to slow down enough to notice it. The months that followed moved at a different pace than the ones before them. Not slower exactly, but steadier. The difference between water rushing downhill and water finally finding a riverbed wide enough to hold it. Mara finished the repairs on the house through the fall, working alongside Cal and Sam, and, more often than she'd expected, Hollis himself, who'd taken to showing up most Saturdays with no more excuse than figured you could use an extra set of hands, though Mara suspected, by then, that the real reason had less to do with hands and more to do with the particular loneliness of a man who'd lost an old friend and found, unexpectedly, a piece of him still walking around in his grandniece. She used some of the money from the cabinet carefully, not spent all at once, not squandered on anything that felt like it belonged to the old fear of scarcity, rather than the new, tentative sense of enough, a proper roof, a rebuilt kitchen, a small fund set aside, on Sam's advice, for whatever came next with the spring, if anything ever did. The rest she left largely untouched, sitting in an account that still felt, some mornings, too large and too strange to be entirely real. What she spent more freely, she found, was time. She spent it at Patsy's counter most evenings, no longer a stranger being studied, but a regular being teased. She spent it with Cal, whose small carpentry business had grown enough by early winter that he'd taken on his first paying job outside Mara's own property, a debt paid forward, though neither of them called it that out loud. She spent it, some Sunday afternoons, sitting with Hollis on her rebuilt porch while he told her stories about Elias that had nothing to do with money or land at all. The time he'd talked a whole church congregation out of shunning a family after a scandal nobody quite remembered the details of anymore. The winter he'd walked 4 miles through snow to bring medicine to a farm too far out for the county doctor to bother with. He wasn't a saint, Hollis told her once, late in the fall, both of them watching the light go long and gold across a yard that no longer looked anything like the ruin she'd first climbed through. Stubborn as a fence post, and proud enough to let a whole family rift go 20 years past when he should have swallowed it. But he showed up for people, over and over, in the ways that mattered most. Man like that leaves more behind than money, even when the money's part of the story too. Mara thought about that a great deal, turning it over the way she'd once turned over the brass key, testing its shape, learning what it actually opened. The spring itself she left alone through the winter, unwilling to rush into anything that might turn it into the very thing Elias had spent his life protecting it from becoming. But she walked out to it often, a clear pool at the edge of the tree line she'd found only after Cal's grandfather had described roughly where the old survey crew had marked it, and sat beside it some evenings with a cup of coffee, thinking. She wasn't going to build a resort. That much she knew with a certainty that surprised her, given how much a resort's money could have meant to a woman who'd once counted $41 as the whole of what she had in the world. But she found herself, over the winter, sketching out something smaller and slower instead. A modest bathhouse, built the way Elias would have built it, serving the town rather than strangers bust in from Roanoke for a weekend spa package. A place where Hollis's arthritis might actually find some relief, where Patsy could soak her feet after a double shift, where the whole quiet economy of a small hollow could circulate a little easier without ever needing to become a business empire. She brought the idea to Sam first, half expecting him to talk her out of the scale of it, or into a bigger version instead. He did neither. Elias would have built exactly that, Sam said, studying her sketches at her kitchen table, if he'd ever let himself want something built instead of just protected. Man spent so long guarding this place, he forgot sometimes that guarding something and growing it aren't opposites if you go about it careful enough. That conversation stayed with her longer than she expected. She'd spent 5 years of her life guarding herself the same way Elias had guarded his land. Walls up, nothing risked, nothing let in that might later be taken away. And somewhere in a burned-down ceiling and a locked cabinet, and a storm she'd braced with her own 2 hands, she'd started, without quite choosing to, growing instead. Near the season's first real cold snap, a young woman named Bree showed up at Patsy's counter one evening, 19 years old, aged out of the same system Mara had once aged out of herself, drifting through Millhaven, on her way to nowhere in particular, with a backpack and a look in her eyes that Mara recognized immediately, because she'd worn it herself less than a year before. Patsy, without asking Mara first, gave the girl Mara's name and a rough set of directions, and Mara found her standing at the edge of the drive 2 evenings later, looking up at the rebuilt house with the same wary, hopeful doubt Mara remembered feeling herself. That first day, staring at a porch she'd been half certain would collapse under her weight. Patsy said you might know what it's like, Bree said, not having anywhere else to go. Mara looked at her, at the backpack, at the guarded shoulders, at the particular exhaustion of a person who'd learned young that nobody was coming to save her, and felt something settle into place that she hadn't fully expected to feel this soon, this early in her own rebuilding. "I do know," Mara said. "Come inside. It's cold, and I've got coffee, and it turns out I know a fair bit about starting over with nothing." Bree stayed the winter, first in the guest room Mara hadn't known she'd need until she needed it. Then, come spring, in a small renovated cottage out past the tree line that had once been little more than a collapsed tool shed. The first thing Mara built entirely from scratch rather than repaired, with Cal's crew doing the framing, and Bree, insistent on learning rather than simply receiving, doing more of the interior work herself than either of them expected she'd have patience for. "You don't have to do this," Bree told her once, midwinter, sitting at the same kitchen table where Mara had once counted $31,000 with shaking hands. "Take in strangers. Fix up their whole lives." "I'm not fixing your life," Mara said. "You're doing that part yourself. I'm just not letting you do it alone in a parking lot somewhere the way I did." She thought of the ledger, still sitting in its leather folder, decades of small kindnesses moving forward one name at a time, never quite finished, never meant to be. "Somebody did that for me, in his own strange way, even though I never got to thank him for it directly. Seemed like the least I could do was keep it moving." By the following spring, the bathhouse was finished. Small, unglamorous, exactly what she'd sketched at that kitchen table over the winter, built with local hands and Cal's careful joinery, and a mineral spring that ran the way it had always run, unbothered by any of it. Hollis was there the day it opened, soaking his arthritic knees with an expression of such profound, undignified relief that Patsy took a photograph of it that ended up taped to the diner's register for the rest of the year. Cordell, to everyone's mild surprise, sent a card rather than showing up in person, a short note, still stiff with old pride, wishing her well with what he called "your uncle's project, finally finished properly." Mara kept that note too, in the same folder as the letter and the withdrawal notice, a small, strange collection of a feud, finally, quietly, laid to rest. She thought, sometimes, on the evenings she sat by the spring with her coffee going cold, about the version of herself who'd driven up Cutter's Hollow Road with $41 and a garbage bag's worth of belongings, certain that whatever waited for her at the end of that drive would be one more temporary thing to survive before the next collapse came along. That woman hadn't known yet that surviving and building were different skills entirely, that you could spend a whole life very good at the first one and never once believe yourself capable of the second, until something forced the question. She understood now what Elias Whitfield's letter had meant, in a way she hadn't been ready to understand it the morning she first read it at this same kitchen table. The money had never been the point. It had bought her time, bought her tools, bought Cal his first real job, and the bathhouse its lumber. But none of that would have meant anything if she hadn't been willing to stay, plank by plank, storm by storm, through the parts where staying was harder than leaving would have been. The land had been the real inheritance, not because of what sat beneath it, but because of what it had asked of her in order to keep it. Patience and stubbornness, and a willingness to let people help her who she'd have once turned away on principle. Elias had built a whole life out of a broken-down house and a room full of strangers who needed more tending than judging. She understood, finally, standing in a doorway he'd once stood in himself, that she'd built the same thing, more or less, without ever setting out to copy him. It had simply been the only honest way forward, once she'd let herself look for one. On a warm evening in early summer, nearly a year to the day since she'd first pried the boards off that back room door, Mara sat on her porch with Bree and Hollis and a fresh pot of Patsy's coffee between them. The bathhouse lights glowing faint through the trees, the mineral spring running quiet and steady, the way it had run for longer than any of them had been alive. "You ever think about what would have happened," Bree asked, "if you'd sold to Cordell that first week, taken the easy money and gone somewhere else?" Mara considered it honestly, the way she tried to consider most things now, rather than reaching for the easy answer. "I think I'd have survived it," she said. "I was good at surviving, but I don't think I'd have known what this felt like." She gestured, not just at the house, but at the whole quiet, healed shape of the evening around her. Hollis's easy company, Bree's cautious trust, a town that had stopped calling her the Whitfield girl and started, simply, calling her by name. Turns out there's a difference between having enough to get by and having something worth staying for. I didn't know that difference existed until I had both to compare. She thought of Elias's letter, still kept safe in its folder. The cabinet was never the gift. The chance was the gift, and understood, at last, exactly what he'd meant. Not every inheritance arrives wrapped the way you expect it to. Sometimes it's a fortune. More often, if you're paying attention, it's simply a door someone left unlocked long enough for you to finally be ready to walk through it. If you've ever been handed something that looked like nothing, and had to decide for yourself whether that was true, I hope this story found you at the right time to hear it. If it did, stay a while longer. There's always another door worth opening, and I'd love to have you here when the next one does.